Peter Dannheisser is a chartered psychologist. He began his career working as an audience researcher, moving into broadcasting regulation in the commercial sector and subsequently working for the BBC as head of its programme complaints unit. Then in 1995 he moved on to the greener pastures of Ofsted, the Office for Standards in Education, in which he worked for nearly a decade, as well as being Secretary of the Media Society. His interests are far-reaching, ranging from the legal status of narcotics to public broadcasting and the right to privacy, all issues we will be dealing with today. Well, Peter, really welcome to the English Hour. It's a great thrill to have you with us.
Great pleasure, William.
Oh, bless you. We've got three subjects for discussion. One is drugs, one is the actual state of the broadcasting, particularly the BBC, and the third is the issue of, of privacy, which is quite a subject in itself. So, drugs. The 1916 UN Convention on Narcotic Drugs provides an international legal framework for drug criminalization. Such legislation prohibits substances considered to have a severe negative effect on the body and mind of the user and whose wide use would bring harm to the public good. In order to account for the varying effects of different drugs, many countries adopt a classification system in which a drug is considered Class A, or B or C, ranging from the most to the least harmful. Different drugs are associated with different activities and cultures. By way of example, in the West, cocaine, a Class A drug, is associated with the world of young professionals and high-tension work environments, whereas anabolic steroids, Class C, are limited to the world of bodybuilders and athletes. The prevalence of a drug may also vary by region. Heroin use is more common in Afghanistan than anywhere else because of its widespread cultivation in that country. Cannabis represents a special case. Some claim that it may be used beneficially, even outside of a strictly medical context. This has led to an international push towards decriminalization. Led by the Netherlands, in which it has been legal to buy cannabis from certain locations since 1976, an additional 14 countries have opted for its decriminalization. In some, such as Spain, this involves allowing people to grow the plant for personal use, whereas in Uruguay, the government grows the plant and sells it to registered users. These issues are set against a backdrop of more fundamental questions regarding the point at which widespread drug use infringes on the public good. So, Peter, drugs. We've got a world in which recreational drugs are, they're a big feature. And you know and I know, in some countries they have virtually destroyed many young people. You look at Iran, right next to Afghanistan with its vast poppy production. Iran, the opium use and the heroin use is rife amongst young people, and it's had a devastating effect. Other countries, it's not such a problem. Many European countries, recreational drugs are less of a problem than alcohol. And,
That's right.
And we have, our own prisons are filled with violent criminals who have committed crimes drunk on alcohol. So, in many instances, that's the real problem. Nonetheless, drugs are with us, and drugs are rife, and you would argue what? For their legalization?
Well, I would like to consider decriminalisation, which is something slightly different. I come from a point of view, this is a bee in my bonnet, I have no specialised knowledge, but I have lived through a period in which Others have tried to fight a war against crime, a war against drugs, and has believed that by stamping out the production of drugs, they can somehow solve the problem. Now, I'm not for the production of drugs, but I have come to the realization that that war on the production of drugs has been a failure. In Afghanistan, for example, I believe that poppy production now is at a record level. It dipped for 1 year during the process of trying to control it, for 1 year alone, and then it took off again. So we are not succeeding in that element, which is the supply of drugs.
Yes.
We're now reading about legal highs, that is to say, drugs which have an effect, psychosomatic effect on people and psychological effect on people, which are perfectly legal. The law cannot keep up with the numbers of drugs, and therefore my look at the whole problem is one of the demand side rather than the supply side. And when we get onto privacy, there's an odd parallel there, but let's talk about that later.
But yet, I mean, you have to distinguish, don't you? I mean, it's quite different, or in my view anyway, there are huge differences between the use of cannabis and the use of heroin. Heroin is a drug that arguably, when people have an absence of the drug, heroin addicts haven't got their drug, then they become very aggressive. It can make for a lot of social problems.
Absolutely.
Whereas maybe not the cannabis, there are other issues, but there are issues with almost every recreational drug. There are issues with alcohol, which is also a recreational drug, to be fair, and some of the issues with alcohol are more serious than, as we said, than with cannabis, for instance.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, every drug comes with its problems and its set of problems. So we shouldn't surely be arguing for a society in which drugs are more easily available.
Well, I think we have to look at the nature of the problem. In this country, and I can only talk about this country, the spend on alcohol is hugely more than the spend on drugs, even though drugs are illegal and therefore relatively costly. Alcohol, the average spend is about £32 a year.
The average spend
a week, I'm so
week,
sorry.
yeah,
£32 a week.
Yes,
that's
yes.
the average. On tobacco, it's
Yeah.
something like £18.
Yeah, £32 about $40.
And
I
on
suppose,
illegal
yeah.
drugs, something like £8 a week. So in terms of the spend of individuals, it's relatively little. When you think about the harms that those drugs do, including alcohol, I think it is fairly obvious to everybody that the direct harms from alcohol are greater than the direct harms for other people on drugs. Most drugs affect the poor sufferers, then their immediate families, of course, but they're not actually hugely antisocial vehicles, ways in which that...
Yeah.
And so really, they're not as bad as they are painted. The trouble is with drugs at the moment, and that's the sort of area I want to get onto, because they're illegal, they're costly, they fund huge amounts of crime. You could argue that they have funded warlords, they have funded all sorts of miscreants, they have funded families who have warred against each other. And the poor farmer who grows the poppies hardly gets anything out of the whole process at all. The prisons are absolutely full of people who are not helped, they try, to get over their alcoholism and their drug addiction. And the reason they're full is not because of the drugs, but because of the concomitant need to rob, steal, and so on, to fund the drug habit.
So you're thinking legalization would cut the need for drug-related crime, but I mean...
Well, let's make a distinction between legalization, which is everything goes, and decriminalization. Decriminalization means individuals who are caught having a reasonable amount of drugs, meaning that they're not drugs for trading, but they're drugs for their own consumption, are then put through a medical way of dealing with the problem rather than a criminal way of dealing with the problem. That's beginning in some countries. For example, Portugal for 13 years very successfully has decriminalised totally cannabis.
Well, we've effectively decriminalised cannabis use in the UK, haven't we? I mean, it may not be technically, but in reality, de facto, it's decriminalised.
Right. So if you extend that to the poor addicts who are, say, on heroin, who would like, and the majority, one reads, are dying, literally dying, to get off those habits, then put them through, take them away from crime and give them some kind of support all the way through, decriminalise them, will be a sensible way of dealing with it.
Yeah, but I still don't get it. I mean, we have a situation, for instance, let's assume that we went down your route and we said, okay, drugs use is decriminalised. You're still going to prosecute the dealers, is what you're saying. So that'll still be a crime. The production, the
yes.
marketing, the
yes.
sale of the drugs is a criminal offence under your proposal.
Yes.
But just the use is decriminalised.
But if you had a world situation in which, for example, all addiction was treated medically, that if they needed drugs or drug substitutes, they could get it from the state under controlled conditions within clinics, not able to trade it, etc., etc., then where would the living be for those people who are dealing in drugs?
Somebody has to produce it, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly could. And we produce drugs at the moment. They're done under very controlled conditions for medical purposes. That could be extended. We're not talking about huge amounts.
So but then let's take one step back from it. You would acknowledge that all of these drugs, almost without exception, are harmful to the individual. I mean, even
yes.
cannabis, long-term use.
Yes. Probably my breakfast was harmful to me this morning.
Yeah, but there's a
won't
difference.
go into details.
I mean, yes.
But the harm.
I know, but Peter, I have a friend, an acquaintance who's a long-term cannabis user,
yes.
who's now my age, and his thinking has visibly slowed. I mean,
I don't disagree for a minute.
Yes.
I don't disagree for a minute, but as I said, there are a lot of things that are harmful. There is a total difference between trying to treat the problem medically or socially or psychologically and dealing with it criminally. And the bottom line, William, is that it hasn't worked. We have a falling number of people who are taking cannabis at the moment in this country. It's almost halved over the last 20 years. But the level of serious drug taking, which is very low, by the way, it's about 2.5% of the population ever. 2.5% of youngsters, that's between 16 and 24. That has remained steady. And the reason is that most people actually come off their drugs. I'm sorry to hear about your friend, and that's serious on cannabis, obviously. And cannabis has changed and has become quite strong, and psychologically more active, although the jury's out about how serious that is. But the number of serious drug takers hasn't changed a lot, and yet we're banging up all sorts of people in prison.
Banging up imprisoning, yes.
And the cost, I mean, do you know how much it costs to put somebody in prison?
Well, I can imagine.
Well, I can tell you. It's about 40,000 English pounds a year. That's more than a very good public school in this country. And that's, if they weren't there, there'd be a huge amount of money available for medical treatment of drug problems.
Interesting. And yet, I'm still not convinced. You have, let's say you had decriminalisation
Yes.
of the use of,
Yes.
of drugs. I mean, you can't extend that across the board. It's one thing to talk about that with regard to cannabis, but what about, Class A drugs, heroin, cocaine, and so forth? They're very dangerous if...
They're only dangerous, and they are dangerous, and they're terrible, to the individuals who take them and their immediate family because of that. They're also dangerous because the people who take them have to very often rob, steal, whatever, to fund that habit. We could remove that by decriminalisation. The number of people are very small, and the bottom line is it ain't working. We are not solving the problem by trying to stop poppy growth or big dealers and so on. Little people are always put in prison, but the big dealers and the big cartels are not. We know that. So my very practical suggestion is that because we are failing to do anything about it by tackling the supply side, we should try and tackle the demand by decriminalising, and we can do it experimentally. There are experiments in the States now. In Colorado is one example,
Yes.
Washington State is the other. They're fairly new, and it's fairly early to say whether that's working, and that's just on cannabis and so on. But it is a beginning. We could do it in this country, or we could say take a region of this country and see whether we could do something. The point is that whenever I talk to a politician about this, they say, jolly good idea, but it won't run politically.
Well, there is truth in that.
And there is truth in that.
Because most Britons, I mean, I'm talking about this country, but it would apply to any country, or most Syrians, or most whatever. I mean, most people, most citizens in most countries really are deeply disturbed by the idea that we legalize, and I always say decriminalize, all right, decriminalize a new drug, another, they see, I mean, we have enough problems coping with alcohol. Now you're going to say, okay, this is acceptable. You're making a statement that this is socially acceptable, aren't you? Once you decriminalize, let's say, heroin or cannabis or anything in between, or not?
I'm not making a statement one way or another. All I am saying is somebody who's addicted needs help, rather than criminalisation. A legal record doesn't work, and therefore we should try something else. It's as simple as that. It ain't working, so fix it. Now, I agree there's a political problem, and I think our politicians all feel that very strongly, and therefore there are more people like me who feel it's worth an experiment. The mood is changing, and I would hope that enough people, maybe not like me, but in better places, will slowly change the mood of the country with respect to that. For example, we've changed the mood of the country about something as simple as wearing safety belts. There was a huge outcry against wearing safety belts in cars. People would be stuck there. What if there was a fire? We can't move comfortably. Yes. It gets in the way, blah, blah, blah. It took years. It took a voluntary period of years and then a legal period now. And it's illegal to drive a car without wearing safety belts, and most people, I think, would go along with that. It's taken years. It's taken a generation. And I think this kind of move won't happen overnight, but it will happen.
But you don't think that if we had, I mean, we don't have in Britain, and we don't have in most countries of the world, proper detox centres for youngsters and so on who are addicted to drugs, and including alcohol, drugs and alcohol. I mean, there are detox centres for older people, but not for young people. And young people are that's the entry level for these addictions. That applies to almost every country of the world. We don't have that. Britain has none at all for young people who are addicted to drugs and alcohol, under 21s, and which is shameful. But isn't it better to stamp on try again to deal with drugs production, to deal with...
William, how long have we been trying?
Well, have we really tried?
Oh, yes.
The Taliban, when they were in control, they stopped it when they chose to. I mean, they were brutal, but they stopped it.
Well, I don't know what you're suggesting in that case.
Well, yes, but
certainly it was attempted. There was an attempt to eradicate crops. That sort of didn't work. I think we've given that a very good go. And my belief is if you can stop a particular drug, others will be invented very quickly. The idea of stamping something out because it exists, well, it's a bit like squashing a balloon. It will, you know, the motivation will mean it'll pop up somewhere else. I don't think it'll work. It hasn't worked thus far, and I admire optimism, but I don't believe it's well placed.
Interesting. And still, we come back to the issue. I mean, it's all very well. There's optimism on your part too, assuming that you're right. It's an assumption I'm not 100% willing to buy into, but I can see the argument. Assuming you're right, then the great British public, or the public of any country in the world, I mean, there are societies where decriminalization of drugs has taken place. The Netherlands,
Portugal
Colorado,
in particular, not so much the Netherlands actually,
but
apart from in one or two coffee shops. Yeah.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
Well, but at the end of the day, our society is not in a place where they would accept that. It is.
We've got to try and persuade people, and also look at the costs, because the costs in crime, in prison, in lives ruined because of criminal records, work that can't be done because people are in prison because they have stolen something to fund their habit. It's enormous. And therefore, my feeling is if somebody does a proper cost benefit on the whole thing, it will actually appeal, if not to the British morality, then the British sense of financial wisdom, to cut out a lot of those costs and spend them on medical support. And you're right, the medical support for youngsters isn't there as much as it should be, but I think it could be reinforced.
Interesting. Well, at the end of the day, it is an ethical issue.
It is.
And cost aside, it's a major issue. Peter, thank you. I mean, we'll have to move on to our next subject for discussion, but it's certainly thought-provoking.
Okay.
And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Most countries have some form of state-funded radio and television broadcasting, providing both educational content and news coverage to their populations. In a perfect world, state funding shields broadcasting from market forces and other private interests. Major state broadcasters in today's world include the BBC, Voice of America, Al Jazeera, and Russia Today. Given that the states concerned subsidize these outlets, they should ideally remain neutral or be representative of public opinion, upholding the public good over factional interest. Complications arise over the question of independence of public broadcasting. Should state broadcasters strive to remain independent from government so as to avoid becoming a mouthpiece for a political party or an ideological position? So Peter, we move on, broadcasting, and particularly the BBC. I mean, explain to me, because obviously we have state broadcasters, Al Jazeera, or we have, well, you could say Al Jazeera is quasi-independent, but nonetheless state-funded broadcasters, and many others, Russia Today and so forth. Then we have the BBC. Is there any distinction between that and the rest?
Oh boy. The BBC is not a state broadcaster. It is a national broadcaster. It's not funded directly by the state, and the state puts at arm's length any control over the particular broadcaster. It is quite difficult, and I have a problem explaining it sometimes to people from other countries, that it is a kind of British compromise. The BBC is run under a charter, and that means really the sovereign and the state itself is separate from the sovereign. The sovereign, the crown, decides that it will give the broadcasting rights to a particular organisation called the BBC, and every 10 years will review that charter. The charter is framed in very general terms.
So, I mean, therefore, in that sense, what did you call it? It's not a state broadcaster.
It's a national broadcaster.
National. Then Al Jazeera would be a national broadcaster.
And it's nationally funded. And it's funded through a complicated system called the license fee, which every household pays towards. Every household that can receive live broadcasting, radio, but television is what is based on.
But nonetheless, that is a form of tax.
It's a... the BBC would say, no, it's a form of payment. You pay for a license. You can choose not to have the license, but then you cannot watch live television, and that's what you're stopped from watching. Yeah. But you can watch other channels, and you can watch recordings.
You can't watch other channels. You can't watch independent television.
You could watch it on your computer in all sorts of other ways these days. So that's part of what we're going to be talking about, which is the license fee system. Hitherto, and still it is true that most people in the country, I think 97% was the last figure I saw, watch or listen to the BBC every week. So and that's live broadcasting. So it is still hugely important in this country, despite all the other channels that are arranged around now.
Yeah, and this national broadcaster is not really unique, because therefore in those terms Al Jazeera would be a national broadcaster. It has an independent corporation of sorts that runs it. It is funded in some way by the state, but nonetheless it's, I mean, is that correct? Would you call that a national broadcaster? Is that what we're talking about?
I don't know enough about Al Jazeera. I can say that the BBC is funded separately from the state, and although the state has input in how much the license fee can be, and it's discussed and agreed over the next 10-year period, and we're into that period now where we are looking at a green paper which is reviewing the charter, which will be renewed at the end of next year, 2016. And so we're having discussions right now about how to fund the BBC, whether the licence fee system, which has been in existence ever since the BBC started in the 20s, is fit for purpose still in the day of the internet.
Now, our viewers are going to be particularly interested in the BBC World Service, which is the international arm of the BBC, which used to be a state broadcaster, because it used to be funded by the state.
That's correct.
And yet came under or was it? Was that also a national broadcaster, because did it also have this independent corporation running it?
The BBC ran it, but at the behest, if you like, of the Foreign Commonwealth Office at the time, through a grant. And of course the Foreign and Commonwealth Office then could decide quite a lot of the broad framework of the World Service. For example, what countries should be best served, what languages, etc., etc. It was a discussion between the BBC World Service and
that's still the case.
That is not so much the case now. It's interesting that the World Service now is paid for out of the licence fee money that comes to the BBC.
And yet we have cut broadcasting to certain countries, and that, I mean, certainly certain East European, certain Balkan states, I believe Serbian language service may have been cut. Anyway, I don't want to get too specific because I'll get too wrong, but I'm aware that there have been cuts made in regions, presumably at the behest of the government, not at the behest of the BBC.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm not party to those conversations, but what it comes down to in the end is that the BBC pays for the piper, and therefore to some extent calls
the government
the tune.
Pays the piper.
No, the BBC pays the piper. The BBC pays for the World Service now.
Okay.
And therefore, of course, if the BBC is strapped for cash, they might say, well, why are we producing a language service for a particular country which has no need of it, whereas perhaps we should do something else? I'm not sure that's a BBC decision, but that is how, in theory, it could happen now.
So, is the BBC independent? I mean, is it genuinely independent? It's subject to huge pressure from the state.
It's subject to huge pressure, and the organisation within the framework that is there to protect partly the BBC is the BBC trustees. Now, the BBC used to be run obviously by a board of management, but above that were the governors of the BBC, who were there to some extent to protect the BBC from politicians. They were initially appointed by politicians, the members of the governing body, but they remained even when politicians changed or even parties changed for their term of office. So there was some protection against political interference. Now there is no longer a board of governors because it was thought to be too close to the BBC. So there is now a BBC board of trustees who are separated from the BBC, have broadly the same function. The Green Paper is going to look at their role as well.
So they will. So they basically maintain its independence.
Yes.
And you are an evangelist for this kind of system. You think that, for example, state television in Russia or in Egypt or wherever would be better served, or the people who are more to the point, the people that view state television in Egypt or in Russia or wherever it might be, would be better served if their television was produced by an independent corporation?
I wouldn't dream of suggesting what other countries should do.
Well, no, but do. You're
but
saying it is
I
a
am
good system?
absolutely sure that the BBC's trust, both within this country and particularly abroad, and I've travelled to many, many other countries, is without parallel. And the reason it has this trust is that it has almost entire independence from the politics of the day. Now, I'm not saying they're not part of a culture. They are. The people who work in the BBC are of the BBC, but they're also of the culture that brought them up. And therefore, I can't pretend that they are totally culture-free. I don't think that's possible.
Well, there's always self-censorship,
There's
isn't there?
always self-censorship and choice of subjects or issues and so on. You'll find that everywhere. But in terms of direct political involvement and direct political interference, I think we are amongst the lower end of a spectrum.
And is it under threat? This, I mean, if it is exemplary, if it is something the world should follow as a pattern, as a model, is it under threat?
Well,
here in this country?
There are issues, and there are issues being discussed at the moment. The Green Paper suggests all sorts of other models.
I should explain. I mean, the Green Paper, people won't understand, but that's that's, if you like, a law in draft form, isn't it?
It's a law. It's a discussion document.
Yeah.
Which finally ends up as a white paper, or in this particular case, a new charter for the BBC at the end of next year. So we're at the moment in a discussion phase. We've had feedback till the end of October, I think, from all sorts of people and bodies who want to put in their views and their.
So that is over now.
But when you say, is the BBC under threat, I wouldn't put it that strongly. I would say change is being mooted, and of course there are voices within the government and within the Department of Culture, Media and Sport who would like to see some fairly radical changes.
As in cuts?
Well, one change, for example, is to commercialise the BBC, to have more advertising to fund
Horrifying
it.
thought.
Well,
I mean, how can you have well, there you go. You have a state broadcaster which is also a private sector. Does that exist anywhere else?
Absolutely. There are many patterns within Europe where EBU members, public service, the European Broadcasting Union members, are partially funded by advertising revenue and partially in another way, either taxes or more frequently licence fees.
So you'd regard that as acceptable?
It depends how it's worked, but obviously if there is a commercial imperative, that is a whole new nexus, a whole new drive for a broadcaster. And so far, and
but it will
successfully, the BBC has remained clear of that within this country. The other areas that are up for discussion is whether the licence fee should be pegged in some way, reduced in some way. And in effect, it has been reduced because recently a deal was done between the BBC and the government. The government said, OK, we're going to leave the licence fee much alone. However, you're going to have to give free your services to the over 75s.
But this, I mean, yeah, I'm aware of this, and this works well. But
Well,
what is a rather, I mean, it sounds complex. Our listeners will find it complex,
Yes.
and almost frightening. All this wrangling between the government and the broadcaster. But at the end of the day, effective. You'd say it's an effective system.
It's only effective in as much as the powers that be and the people who are drafting the charter take into account all the views, and that is what's going on at the moment, and why people are exercised, in the BBC in particular, but elsewhere, that we all must try and protect certain elements within the BBC. Can I just mention the licence fee at the moment?
It's highly technical for our listeners, but yes, if you like, it's not something that they're going to be varying. But
okay.
But yes, you mean the fee people pay for the.
Every household pays a certain amount of
Yeah.
a year. At the moment, it's 145 British pounds a year. Now that enables them to watch all sorts of services. That works out per person at something like 40 pence. That's less than half a pound. I can't do that in dollars. It's less than a newspaper would cost, a daily newspaper. So the amount of money is not huge for the services that they get.
And
However,
they are funding the world broadcasting.
they're funding the world's services. They're also funding the over 75s, which you could say is a social service. I mean, our energy companies give money.
Yes.
We get. Older people get a fuel subsidy that comes from government.
Well,
It doesn't come from the producers of the fuel.
Well, one thing I would agree with you. I think it's the whole concept of what you call national broadcasting is a good one. The idea that the broadcaster should be independent of the government of the day, and this concept of a broadcasting corporation or an independent organisation is a magnificent one. I wish more countries copied it. The European Convention on Human Rights upholds a right to privacy in the context of an individual's family life, home and correspondence. Article 7 of the United Nations International Convention on Civil and Political Rights goes further and also defends the privacy of individuals in regard to matters affecting their reputation and honour. The degree to which a politician may have forfeited these rights upon entering into a position of trust and responsibility over his or her fellow citizens has become a subject for debate. Another aspect of the privacy issue was highlighted in the context of the internationally acclaimed WikiLeaks scandal, in which government cables were leaked to the world. Whereas some of those leaks related directly to issues of governance or international relations, others revealed the personal views of government officials. The issue came to the forefront of international media attention once again when Edward Snowden, a former American National Security Agency employee, leaked thousands of intelligence files. The actions of these whistleblowers concerns not only an individual's right to privacy, but also a government's right to secrecy. Where does the right to state secrets begin and freedom of information end? And does the internet age render secrecy impossible? So, Peter, where are we at? We're now going to talk about maybe the most controversial of the lot. Drugs was controversial, but this subject, privacy, I mean, there's so much to it. Where do we begin? Where do you begin? Where do you want to tackle this?
In a way, there's a slight tie-up with our discussion on drugs, because what I want to get to is the idea that to a certain extent at the moment we are dealing with a failing solution. We're not actually managing privacy terribly well.
Here in the UK or worldwide?
I can only talk about the UK.
Yeah.
can I make a slight digression?
Yes, go ahead.
Privacy is a fairly recent concept, and that may come as a bit of surprise to some people. We used to live in little villages. Everybody knew everybody's business. There was no privacy. If you wanted to do something nefarious, something difficult, something illegal, something private, you had to take great care to do it away from the village. Maybe you find a large haystack somewhere.
Yes, okay.
So privacy is a recent thing. I think it's post-industrial revolution. It's post everybody moving into cities, where in fact maintaining some kind of privacy for the first time ever, I'm suggesting, was possible. And therefore we're talking about, what, a couple of 100 years, no more, of privacy, whereas there were thousands and thousands of years where everybody knew everybody's business, where the village brought up every child, to use a cliche, and where it wasn't a problem.
But you still had rules even back then with regard to slander, libel. I mean, people fought duels or whatever. But people, you could not malign or hurt
well,
others.
now we're talking about lying. Now we're talking about untruths.
Okay.
But you can't slander somebody if what you say is correct. You can't libel somebody if you write the truth.
Okay, so privacy.
Privacy is a slightly different issue,
Sure.
though I perfectly understand the link.
Yeah.
So what I'm going on to suggest is that we're not terribly good at handling privacy yet. We clearly need to, because there is so much data out there that could, in the wrong hands, be used very badly. And it's getting worse, and I don't think we're up to speed yet. We're now talking about big data, and that phrase, I believe, means the amalgamation of all sorts of data pools into something that could be hugely useful. I take, for example, I don't know, bank data and inland revenue data.
But there's a difference, isn't there, between the privacy of a private individual and the privacy of a public figure, an actor, a broadcaster, a politician, most especially a politician, who presumably does not have the same rights to privacy that a private citizen does.
Well, I think under the human rights legislation there is no distinction between any people.
But there is a huge ethical distinction between somebody who sets themselves up as an opinion former or a leader of men and women, and therefore is aspiring to have their support in one way or another, aspiring to take public office perhaps, and therefore is in a position of public trust. They have very little right to privacy, surely.
I'm not sure that's correct. In moral terms, it's certainly not correct in legal terms. The human rights legislation, I think it's paragraph 8, guarantees everybody family life and privacy, and that's irrespective of what kind of person it is. However, there is also a freedom of information clause, and so the two are actually neatly balanced. And there's always got to be a balance between, on the one hand, secrecy and privacy, and on the other hand, people's right to know. And that's what is so difficult to handle. If I can go on about data.
Okay, so this is now, we're talking here definitely about the ordinary man or woman in the street, the data affecting them.
Well, we're talking about data for individuals, it could be data for companies, it could be data for nations, it could be security data.
Yeah.
So there's huge amount of information out there. We seem to be concentrating as a people in the UK on ensuring that the data is under guard, lock and key. And that's, we have a commissioner who registers all this data. We have to ensure that it is suitably guarded and so on. And I think that obviously makes sense. If I give my doctor information, I don't want it to get out there. I want it to be private, partly because I don't want other people to know, it's none of their business, partly because the thought that an insurance company, for example, could get hold of my DNA, and that might be able to be done in years to come, is a bit scary.
Yeah, well, that's acceptable. I mean, I would agree. I think everybody listening to this program would agree that all possible safeguards should be in place for your medical data, whatever. Does the same apply to people acting in the public domain on our behalf? I mean,
I make absolutely no distinction. There is no difference.
Why?
Because we all act on other people's behalves, whether it's a nation or our family or our wives or husbands.
So
or
somebody like Julian Assange or Edward Snowden,
yes.
Julian Assange of WikiLeaks, or Edward
Yes.
Snowden, the American military junior soldier that released
Yes.
swathes of data.
Yes.
You're saying that they don't perform a public service when they make government and the workings of our intelligence service and so forth more transparent by releasing this information?
These things are sub judice at the moment, and I can't discuss a particular case. All I can say is that they have revealed the extent to which there is data out there. They have revealed the fact that some organisations perhaps should not collect the data they have, and that again is being discussed right now in our Parliament. How long should people keep data, for example?
Oh, well, let's take a step back and talk about that then. Organisations like in Britain, GCHQ, I'm not sure what GCHQ stands for. Anyway, the
our security systems.
Our security system are gathering every phone call, every piece of data. So everything that we do in terms of, if we use a smartphone, everything is recorded.
Right.
And then they can trawl back through that.
Well, now, that's, can I stop you there? Because that's really the subject of my thesis.
Yes.
Which is, it is going to be absolutely impossible in the future to stop people gathering information. I think it's going to be impossible to secure it absolutely, and we've seen the amount of hacking that is going on at the moment, and therefore I think the emphasis has to be on the use of that data. Now, for example, for GCHQ and others, there is a discussion now about whether the judiciary, as well as the legislature, in other words, judges as well as politicians, should be the people who decide whether a particular tranche of data could be used.
But yet, when it's when you start sifting and gathering this data, I mean, vast amounts of data which they're gathering, inevitably, covertly or overtly by whistleblowers, it's going to be exposed. I mean, the question surely is whether these super organizations should be allowed to gobble up all this private information. I mean, it is primarily the United States and Britain are the two nations in the world that are doing this gobbling of mega data, of vast amounts of information from their populations and from other nations. And these two countries, the US and Britain, are doing this on a vast scale. I mean, it's...
I agree. And therefore there are two problems. One is, how do they use it? And at the moment, for example, our Secretary of State will look at about 2,000 applications for the use of this data for pursuing criminal
but there's an underlying question is it should be allowed.
Well,
in the first
that's
place.
the second element, which is that if all this information is available, it is also liable to be hacked. And
as we've seen repeatedly.
And my thesis is you ain't going to be able to stop it. Now, that's a bit like saying, and it refers to the previous discussion, I don't think we can stop the production of drugs. We have to lean heavily on the use of drugs and try and cut down the need for them.
So you kind of, and you said
in terms of privacy, I don't think we'll ever succeed in cutting down. I mean, you're mentioning state collections of data. I'm worried about the fact that my local supermarket knows more about me than possibly anybody else. The amount of data now, and those can be merged. So if the supermarket, I'm not suggesting it's happening, the supermarket merged with the bank, merged with Inland Revenue, they would know so much about me. I don't think we'd have to worry. If the transport people saw where I was going every day, and they do, because I click in and they know exactly where I'm travelling to, they'd know as much as many people about whom I see. If the telephone companies know who I'm calling and know where I'm going, because they can actually measure where I'm travelling, because I've got a phone in the pocket that tells them, those bits of information are worrying to me. I won't say on the same scale, but on a similar scale as national information.
I think that we need to guard against this intrusiveness by the state and by the commercial sector, by everybody.
Well, the way I would propose us to start thinking about is how to jump with a heavy hand on organisations who use unauthorised data. Now, at the moment,
but at the end of the day, the worst of them is our own governments. Our own governments have been riding roughshod. I mean, you look at some of the use of data. I mean, it's astonishing.
Well, we have to think of what the sanctions are in that case, because we ain't going to be able to stop that data accumulating. That's my point, and it's the similar point. That's why I link it a bit with the drugs thing. We're failing to stop drugs being produced. We will fail to stop data being produced. And the real question for society is, how are we going to use that material?
And this key ethical issue, it is an ethical issue. At the end of the day, all of this intrusiveness in Britain and America, these two super states in a sense, so in data terms, Britain is as bad as America, or as good as, if you prefer. It's being justified on grounds, this intrusiveness is being justified by and large on grounds of national security.
And that is why our Home Secretary has to approve any use of that material, and it is being mooted now, it is being suggested that the judiciary, that judges also have to have a very real and present input onto the use of that information.
But can you really justify what's being done on terms of national security? I mean, if you look at the number of deaths from terrorism in the United Kingdom over the past 10 years, and you look at it, it's fewer than 100. I'm not sure of the number. We have had some terrible terrorist attacks, but it's certainly fewer than 100 in total. I have no idea. Look at that, and then look at the deaths from road accidents or whatever, you know, I mean, any other cause.
I think you're making my case for me very well, which is that there's a huge amount of data there. When it is used, it had better be used for good reason, and therefore the checks and balances within society for the use of that information, whether it's by my bank, whether it's by my local supermarket, or whether it's by government, should be absolutely stringent, and it isn't at the moment. I agree that there haven't been all that many outrages, thank goodness, in this country. The security services would say that's because they exist and have managed to stop various outrages, or have discouraged outrages because they know people know that they will be found out and so on.
Would you say that...
But even if that were not true, even if that was argument, I feel the battle to stop people collecting data has been lost.
And you don't... does that mean that you accept that it is ethically, in view of the threat from terrorism and so on, ethically acceptable to monitor the smartphones of the entire population? I mean, is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is not an ethical argument, it is a practical argument.
Right.
You
So
ain't
given
going to be able to stop it, so how are you going to be able to control its use?
Okay.
That's my personal view. I have no reason other than my personal bee in my bonnet that we have kind of lost that battle. We are not going to be able to stop people collecting covertly or overtly. However, I believe the sanctions for using this information are pathetic. For example, if a company used information that it shouldn't, what's going to happen to that company? It's probably going to get a fine, which will only put up costs for everybody using that company's products, especially if it is one of very few companies. What we need to do is to be able to fire the board, fire the people who run that company, and make sure that the onus and the answerability is there within the company hierarchy.
So you reckon the misuse of information should be criminalised?
Absolutely.
Interesting. And just to come back to my other point, you think the same law applies to politicians? I mean, I would argue that their private lives are fair game.
How do you feel about film stars?
Now, they're borderline, but they've put themselves in a position of yes, they're funded by the public. They've put themselves in a position of trust. They set an example to our young people. And I think, yes, they too, their public lives are fair
people?
Game. Same. They set an example to the young. Anybody in the public arena.
So that would include yourself?
Yeah. God help me, but yes. Everybody in the public arena
should have special protection?
Should not have special protection.
Should not have special protection. That's interesting. So some of the high-profile cases that have hit our papers have certainly been about public figures who feel they've been traduced or turns out they haven't been. And the ordinary person whose life has been totally wrecked because somebody has bad-mouthed them inaccurately or claimed that they have been, for example, sexually assaulted by somebody when that's turned out to be completely wrong.
So the ordinary person should be protected. I'm talking about the public figure.
Yes.
Should be vulnerable. The public figure should be vulnerable to exposure, their private life, whereas the ordinary person should be protected, the one that doesn't.
So could you write, and I'm not suggesting you do that now, a definition of who is a public figure?
Oh, anybody who sets themselves up.
Well, I think you should stop there, anybody, because we're all public. We all advise people, we teach in schools, we advise people, we're counsellors, we run machines that other people's lives depend on, we fly aeroplanes. Should we all be vulnerable?
But surely, if you're talking about a government official in whom trust has been placed, I mean...
I trust my bus driver. And if he is under the influence, I think I should tell people that he drinks too much.
Very well, yes. So in that context, it affects his job.
Fine.
Yeah.
I'm challenging you. Find one person who isn't in that role some of his time or her time during his or her life.
Fair enough. But nonetheless, if you're in that position...
we're all in that position all the time, is my theory. And that is why we have a law and the justice is blind motto, personified on the Old Bailey by Justice having a blindfold over her eyes. It means irrespective of who is involved, we should apply the same standards.
Well, you maybe have a very good point. I may not want the Prime Minister to have any privacy, but I want my privacy.
But you're a public figure, so
there you go. There you go.
Now, at this moment.
Yes, absolutely. So you have a valid argument. Peter, thank you. It really has been an interesting discussion.
It's been fun, thank you.
Thank you very much. So what have we learnt from Peter Dannheisser? Well, this drugs issue is certainly disturbing. It bothers me. I expect it bothers you, the viewer. I cannot see the decriminalization of hard drugs in any shape or form taking place in the Middle East anywhere. It certainly happened in some places. It's happened, as he rightly points out, in Portugal. Has it been successful? The jury is out, I would say. The question for us is whether this drug decriminalization actually brings reduced drug use. That's a real concern, a real worry. And then he talks about the issue of state broadcasting. And here he is definitely right. We need somehow to have more independence in state broadcasting, not only in Britain, but across the world. It's excellent and wonderful that we have state-subsidized broadcasting or national broadcasting, but we need independent corporations, independent forums controlling our state broadcasting so that we really can have a truly independent media. And then, finally, we discussed the whole issue of privacy. Now, what an issue that is. What a business. I'm very worried. I don't know whether but you, the viewer, are very worried. You know that groups like GCHQ, I believe it stands for General Communications Headquarters. It's very disturbing, the power that these groups have. They can actually turn your mobile phone, your cell phone, on in your pocket in order to record your conversation, and you wouldn't be aware of it. They can do that with a smartphone today. It's disturbing, it's worrying, and I think we have to consider very carefully this whole surveillance culture that we have. Is it necessary? And if it is necessary, then the controls must be in place to stop too much surveillance. Otherwise, it really interferes with private liberty. And finally, what about the whistleblowers? Those people that do reveal secrets, one would say, but do reveal confidential issues. What about people like Edward Snowden, now in hiding in Moscow? People of this kind and this caliber. The WikiLeaks founder, Julian Assange, in hiding in an embassy here in London. Are these people heroes or are they villains? What do you think? It's a real issue for today, and our privacy is an issue we should all be concerned about. So what do you, our viewers, think? We would really be grateful to hear your opinions. Do email us here at ANN Television. You can email me at the English Hour, and the email address is here, right here on the screen now. Take note of it. Email me, email us, email ANN if you can, with your views, your opinions. Thank you so much for being our guests here on ANN Satellite Television today.